in public safety communication equipment. And I want to warn everyone in the room first, not our witnesses because they're extremely knowledgeable, that the topic of this morning's hearing is extremely complex, technical, and has kind of made my head swim at times. However, I do believe that is very, very important to public safety and good government. We have learned important lessons from Oklahoma City, September 11, Columbine High School, and Hurricane Katrina, and other disasters that interoperable equipment and communication is crucial to effective emergency response. When time is of the essence and lives are at stake, a clear flow of information is absolutely essential. Unfortunately, it is not uncommon for police officers, firefighters, and other emergency responders from different regions, from a single region, or even a single city to be using incompatible communication systems which don't talk to each other. This lack of interoperability has contributed to the deaths of first responders and hindered the ability to rescue people in harm's way. Enabling interoperable communication systems, where public safety personnel can talk with each other in real time, takes planning and cooperation by all levels of government. Interoperability also requires equipment that is capable of communicating with each other, and assuring interoperability requires complete standards, conformance testing, and compliance assessment. First responders on digital land mobile radio systems built to proprietary specifications cannot communicate well. Lack of published standards and compliance may also have consequences for competition among equipment vendors and consequently options for and prices to emergency service agencies. When I visited NIST's Interoperability and Standards Lab this past February in Boulder, Colorado, I was shocked to learn that after more than 20 years of development, the vast majority of standards needed to assure interoperability for first responders and to enhance competition for the benefit of purchasers are not yet usable. This puts first responders at unnecessary risk and provides governmental purchasers with less competition than they would otherwise have. Since 1989, the public safety community and industry have been working together on Project 25, or P25, a suite of standards that will not only enable interoperability but also produce competition in the marketplace for digital land mobile radio systems and provide other benefits. While there has been some progress on the P25 standards since 1989, the standards remain incomplete. In this hearing, I'd like to understand the implications of this for public safety agencies procuring systems sold as P25 compliant. I'd also like to get a better sense of when we can expect all of the standards to be completed or at least usable. For purposes of comparison, we have standards for cell phones and other forms of communication, and not only standards, but with respect to cell phones, we have gone through G1, Generation 2, Generation 3, and now we're transitioning to G4 devices, and standards have been established for all of these different generations of devices. A second issue that we will discuss today is the lack of a formal compliance assessment process for the P25 standards. A compliance assessment process tells purchasers that a product meets all the requirements of a standard. Any laptop with a Wi-Fi logo, Bluetooth-enabled devices, or indeed any toaster with an Underwriter Lab sticker had to go through testing and certification to be able to display those marks. P25 does not have an equivalent independent testing and certification process. The Department of Homeland Security's compliance assessment program can fill this gap. It seems to me that emergency services communication is too important for caveat emptor to be the standard. Also, when first responders spend millions of dollars on new, complex communications technology, expecting interoperability, conformance, and relying upon the P25 logo, they should not come up empty-handed. In addition to being mission-critical and life-critical technology, these systems represent major expenditures for governmental agencies around the country. I and most other members of Congress are asked every single year for funds to upgrade emergency responder communication systems. Taxpayers deserve both safety and value for their dollar. I'd like to thank our witnesses for being here today. It is important that this process move forward and that the public safety community and industry continue to work together to make further advances in first responder technology. And now I'd like to recognize Mr. Smith for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for calling today's hearing on the interoperability of public safety communications equipment, specifically Project 25 or P25 standards. In nearly every public safety emergency, as the events mentioned by the chairman to the baseball-sized hailstones that hit my home community this week, we are reminded of the need for our first responders to have interoperable communications across both jurisdiction and lines of duty. Although the P25 standard was initiated in the late 1980s, it was the terrorist attacks on September 11th which prompted government and industry to actively implement these standards, with action continuing to this day. All parties clearly understand it is in their interest to ensure emergency communications tools advertised as P25 compliant meet that standard. At the federal level, we have a responsibility to ensure local jurisdictions are able to work together and taxpayer dollars are spent only on equipment which works as promised. Equipment manufacturers know sales will go elsewhere if competitors' products achieve higher levels of operability and interoperability. And our first responders clearly understand the importance of interoperable equipment in protecting the lives of themselves and certainly those whom they serve. At the same time, we must keep in mind interoperability is inconsequential if outside forces such as power outages actually knock out equipment, and advances in technology and increased availability of bandwidth may move us to technologies above and beyond P25 standards. I expect the primary questions addressed in this hearing will be what has been achieved so far, where is it going, and is it progressing quickly enough, while also touching on where emergency communications may go into the future. With that, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to the panelists for sharing your insight and expertise, and I look forward to a constructive hearing. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Smith. If there are other members who wish to submit opening statements, your statements will be added to the record at this point. And now it is my pleasure to introduce our witnesses. Dr. David Boyd is the Director of the Command, Control, and Interoperability Division of the Science and Technology Directorate at the Department of Homeland Security. Mr. Dereck Orr is the Program Manager of the Public Safety Communication Systems Program at the National Institute of Standards and Technology, or NIST. Dr. Ernest Hofmeister is Senior Scientist at the Harris Corporation. Dr. John Muench is the Director of Business Development of Motorola. And our final witness is Chief Jeffrey Johnson, who is President of the International Association of Fire Chiefs and the Chief of the Tualatin Valley Fire and Rescue Department in Aloha, Oregon. Welcome all. You will each have 5 minutes for your spoken testimony. Your written testimony will be included in the record for this hearing. And since we do have your written testimony and have read it, rather than simply summarizing, please focus your comments as much as possible on answering the following 4 questions. What factors have delayed the development of the needed technical standards? What has delayed conformance and compliance testing? What is the impact of the absence of applicable standards and tests? And when can we expect completion of those standards and tests needed to assure interoperability and competition? When you complete all your oral testimony, we will begin with questions, and each member will have 5 minutes to question the panel. Dr. Boyd, please proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ranking Member Smith. Emergency responders need to be able to respond to incidents using their own equipment particularly when they're supporting jurisdictions other than their own. And they need the ability to exchange the whole range of data, imagery, maps, as well as to communicate by voice and to combine all of those sources of information as needed during an emergency. Any strategy for improving interoperability must be informed by practitioner input. That is, it must be based on actual user needs and driven from the bottom up. Practitioners include the end-user community that supports all aspects of securing the homeland during both day-to-day operations and large-scale incidents or disasters. The existing response infrastructure is complex. As the chairman has already pointed out, there are more than 50,000 different emergency response agencies throughout the United States, each with its own local and state government regulations and requirements. Further, each locality has some form of legacy communication system and its own budget and planning life cycles. The existing public safety communications infrastructure in the United States represents, as a conservative estimate, an investment of more than $100 billion for voice system hardware alone. These existing systems cannot be quickly or easily replaced, so the only way to move toward nationwide interoperability without wasting existing investments is through a system of systems approach which capitalizes on already existing infrastructure. This approach allows agencies to join together using standards, compatible procedures, and training exercises without having to discard major investments in existing systems, and it enables emergency responders to use their own equipment to respond to incidents anywhere in the nation. By leveraging standards, emergency responders can communicate by voice and exchange data, imagery, video, and maps, creating situational awareness that improves response for both daily operations and major incidents. Furthermore, the system of systems approach is naturally more robust. It eliminates the risk that one failed technology or link will cause the entire system to fail. Since 2004, the legislatively established Office for Interoperability and Compatibility, OIC, which is within my office, within the Science and Technology Directorate, has partnered with NIST and the National Telecommunications and Information Administration to accelerate the development of the Project 25 suite of standards for narrowband communication. These standards help produce voice communications equipment that is interoperable regardless of manufacturer while retaining compatibility with legacy systems and permitting scaling from small to large incidents. A few years ago, we discovered through testing that much of the equipment advertised as P25 compliant was unable to interoperate with P25 equipment manufactured by other companies. And in many cases, even with earlier P25 equipment manufactured by the same company. In response, Congress authorized OIC to establish the Compliance Assessment Program in coordination with NIST. A comprehensive compliance assessment program is a key element to improving interoperable communications. It provides a process through which equipment can demonstrate that it correctly follows the standard and is able to interoperate with other equipment that follows that standard. When interoperability testing is combined with conformance testing, emergency responders can be assured that equipment conforms to the standard and will interoperate with all compatible equipment that correctly implements the standard, including equipment that hasn't been tested. Furthermore, conformance testing helps provide increased confidence that equipment developed in the future will retain compatibility with legacy systems. Recognizing the need for an open and transparent process, the program established a governing board to represent the collective interests of organizations that procure P25 equipment. Its membership consists of local, tribal, state, and federal government employees who are active in the operation or procurement of communication systems. The board considers all comments in an ongoing effort to address both the requirements of the users and the concerns of the manufacturers. Using testing standards published by P25, the P25 CAP aims to add quality, openness, and rigor by building on the product development testing already performed by manufacturers. The first group of laboratory assessments began in December 2008, and by April 2009, DHS recognized the first 8 laboratories. 4 different manufacturers have had emergency communications equipment complete the P25 CAP process, which includes publishing suppliers' declaration of compliance and summary test reports. Unfortunately, claims of compliance are not limited to the equipment that has completed the P25 CAP, and this can lead to confusion among emergency responders. As a consequence, we've clarified the definition of P25 compliant equipment through SAFECOM guidance for federal grant programs, which is used by all of the interoperable grant programs outside of DHS as well as in DHS. I appreciate the opportunity to testify before you today. I look forward to continuing to work with emergency responders and manufacturers, and I welcome the committee's interest and support of interoperable communications. I look forward to answering any questions the committee may have.
Thank you, Dr. Boyd. Mr. Orr.
Chairman Wu, Ranking Member Smith, members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today to discuss public safety communications and the P25 project. The Public Safety Communications Research Program, known as PSCR, is a joint effort among NIST and NTIA at Commerce. The PSCR serves as the technical lead for several administration initiatives focusing on public safety communications. From the beginning, one of the core focus areas of the PSCR has been to participate in the Telecommunications Industry Association Land Mobile Radio Standards Development process. The vast majority of our first responders across the nation use land mobile radio systems every day to communicate as they perform their missions. This includes the radios that you see police officers or firefighters wearing on their belts. Interoperability for these radios has been a problem, as we've seen in recent national emergency situations, and achieving interoperability is not possible without the existence of published standards that define how the various components of a public safety communications systems will interoperate, regardless of manufacturer. In the absence of standards, achieving this level of interoperability would not be possible. Public safety users have recognized this for some time. Approximately 20 years ago, representatives from local, state, and federal public safety associations and agencies joined together with industry to address the absence of available standards for land mobile radios as they entered the transition from analog to digital-based systems. Thus, Project 25, or P25 as we know it today, was launched. Based on our experience, there are four main issues with P25 that are hampering progress toward seamless interoperability and open competition. First, since P25's inception in 1989, only 1.5 of the 8 interfaces in the suite of the standards needed for operability, interoperability, and competition as defined by P25 is complete. Second, as a result of the lack of complete standards, only a fraction of any P25 system purchased today is truly standards-based. Third, many public safety agencies believe that when they purchase a system labeled P25, that it is based on a complete set of standards. They interpret a P25 system to mean an LMR system that is fully standards-based. We believe it is important that public safety agencies make their procurement decisions and valuations on realistic set of expectations. Fourth, there has been a lack of industry-led compliance assessment and certification programs. Compliance to the standard is essential, and in fact, every major wireless technology we know of ensures interoperability among devices and adherence to the standards by establishing rigorous and comprehensive compliance assessment and certification programs. P25 should be no different. We need to identify problems with products or the standard in the lab, not in the field. NIST has been actively engaged on behalf of DHS in the P25 process to accelerate the adoption of standards. In addition, to address the lack of compliance testing program, DHS and NIST partnered together to establish the Project 25 Compliance Assessment Program. This is a government-led program outside of the P25 standards development process and was created with the direction from Congress to ensure that federal grant dollars are being spent on communications equipment that will result in interoperability and improve public safety's ability to protect lives and property. From the beginning, the P25 cap was developed with the expectation of incorporating all 3 types of tests, performance, conformance, and interoperability, into the program. However, over the last year, an issue of including conformance tests in the P25 cap has arisen, which has slowed down our ability to launch a fully functional program. I want to make clear, conformance tests are the one type of test that ensures that a product adheres to the written standard and therefore increases confidence that there will be interoperability in the field. However, the general response from industry was that the only performance and interoperability tests were necessary for compliance assessment. DHS, NIST, other federal partners, and many public safety users spent nearly a year trying to find an acceptable resolution that would minimize the burden on industry while maintaining the integrity of the P25 cap through the inclusion of all 3 types of tests. In the absence of achieving consensus, and given public safety's insistence on the inclusion of conformance tests in the P25 cap, the program moved ahead by including conformance tests for the most recently published interface. I am pleased to say that over the last 2 months we have witnessed a willingness within the P25 standards body to actively participate in the identification of relevant conformance tests for the P25 cap. NIST hopes that within 2 years the P25 cap is a fully functional program, including performance, conformance, and interoperability testing for at least the interfaces which are crucial to interoperability. Achieving this will require significant commitment and focus by all parties, and for its part, NIST is prepared to assist in meeting this worthy goal. NIST remains dedicated to continuing to work with this subcommittee, industry, our federal sponsors and partners, and public safety users to see the P25 standards completed and to develop programs that help public safety purchase interoperable land mobile radio equipment. In conclusion, I want to thank Chairman Wu for his leadership on interoperability standards for public safety communications and for the positive effect his involvement has had in moving this issue forward. I am happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Orr. Dr. Hofmeister, please proceed.
Thank you, Chairman Wu. Chairman Wu and distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting me to testify on the interoperability and public safety communications equipment today.
Dr. Hofmeister, have you pressed your button? Have you turned your mic on?
It says talk here. A little closer.
Okay, maybe a little closer.
Let's try this. Is that
Terrific.
okay? Well, thank you again for allowing me to testify. There are a number of technology approaches to achieve increasing levels of operability, going from swapping radios, to gateways, to shared channels, to proprietary shared systems, to standards-based shared systems. Harris believes that all of these approaches are deployed today to achieve varying levels of interoperability. At the upper end of the interoperability capability are standards-based systems, standards-based shared systems. The predominant standard for these systems in the U.S. is the TIA P102 P25 suite of Project 25 standards. The number of deployed P25 systems is increasing, and the level of interoperability across these systems provided by different vendors is increasing, and with radios provided by different vendors. As a quick standard summary, the TIA 102's P25 standards suite consists of approximately 69 published standards, with about 13 in ballot as new, revised, or addendum standards, and with about 15 in draft. The suite addresses 11 defined Project 25 interfaces in the categories of service, system, and equipment. The P25 interfaces critical for interoperability and competition, the Common Area Interface, the Inter RF Subsystem, the ISSI, and the Fixed Station Interface are specified in more detail in the current suite than some others. While some not involved in standards development process might comment that the standards development takes a long time, the TIA process, like other standards development organizations, is a consensus-based process by design. The standards are developed by top engineers from industry who have the knowledge and perspective to assure successful product implementation to the standard. Getting to consensus and developing the requisite detail of the standard takes time, but the resultant standard product is technically solid and long-lasting. Harris believes that since 2005, the standards pace is at full industry and user support capacity. We have many meetings where everybody's making contributions, so we're kind of working at capacity that we have, I believe, in the industry. Now, there were several questions asked, and I'm going to try to answer what I can in the testimony here. One was, what is the status of public safety land mobile radio standards in terms of meeting the original P25 goals of enabling interoperability, competition among vendors, spectrum efficiency, graceful migration, and user-friendly equipment? Harris believes that the P25 community has made strong progress in meeting each of these cited goals, specifically for the first three. For enabling interoperability for standards, radios, and radio infrastructure, detailed Common Area Interface radio product design and interoperability test standards are in place, and multiple vendor radio products and infrastructure radio products have demonstrated a high functional level of interoperability through the formal CAI interop testing as part of the CAP program over the last year. As Dr. Boyd mentioned, over 20 radio products or radio classes from 4 vendors have been approved as suppliers' declarations of compliance posted to the official website. For enabling interoperability with systems and networks, detailed ISSI baseline product design and interoperability test standards are in place. The P25 CAP requirements are in place. The first ISSI products are emerging. Informal ISSI interoperability testing among a number of vendors has already taken place. Formal ISSI interoperability testing as part of the P25 CAP is expected over the next year. For competition among vendors, radio vendors, fairly strong competition in the radio has developed, with over 15 vendors providing P25 radio products across a variety of frequency bands. Competition among P25 system and network vendors has developed, with 5 vendors supplying P25 systems. Almost all large P25 system procurements have a separate system and infrastructure procurement and radio user procurement, so there is competition on both levels. For spectrum efficiency, from the start, the P25 Common Air Interface provided the 12.5 kHz narrowband capability and voice efficiency required for our 2013 narrowbanding part of the below 512 band, and now in the 700 MHz public safety band. The Phase 2 Common Air Interface for 2-slot TDMA is well along in development, will enable meeting the 6.25 kHz per voice path requirement for the 700 MHz band ahead of the January 1st, 2017 deadline, as well as the future unspecified requirement for the below 512 band. What mechanism exists for customers to have confidence that P25 equipment will be interoperable and function as intended? There are several layers in place. First, P25 manufacturer's design and extensive internal product verification test processes are already in place, Harris and others. There's a past industry practice. The manufacturers with deployed or deploying systems developed a practice of communicating and resolving cited interoperability issues. P25 CAP is another layer that's been installed recently. The DHS recognized labs are implementing the P25 CAP that performs formalized testing to the standards and requirements to provide additional assurance of interoperability for performance and conformance to the standards for critical interfaces. Harris supports a solid, practical DHS P25 CAP program and associated testing for the benefit of our customers, other public safety agencies, users, and manufacturers. Harris developed and maintains a DHS-recognized compliance laboratory. Procurement requirements are also procurement agencies have the ability to specify special tests, demonstrations as part of the procurements, and we are seeing that to get the assurance. So Chairman Wu and other members, thank you for the opportunity to testify today and share with you the Harris views on interoperability in public safety communications equipment. Interoperability is a multidimensional challenge that involves 5 interdependent elements: governance, standard operating procedures, technology including standards, training and exercises, and uses. The level of interoperability achieved depends on the progress in each of the elements and the coordination and management of the 5 elements. My remarks have focused on the practical technical solutions. For reasons higher levels of interoperability, Harris believes that while more work is needed, strong progress has been made in recent years through the continued P25 standards development, the CAP testing, and public safety procurement requirements. The product P25 standards, the testing standards, and the product features are in place or soon will be in place to enable a solid level of P25 trunk in conventional system interoperability. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd be happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hofmeister. Mr. Muench.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Smith. When the P25 standard was first envisioned by APCO, the goal was to create a vibrant marketplace for public safety equipment that allows all vendors to compete on a level playing field. This goal has been achieved, providing interoperability, product innovation, and price competition to the public safety market. Motorola took an early lead in the development of the Project 25 radio systems, and today over 13 radio manufacturers sell Project 25 equipment to public safety users throughout the world. Project 25 started with the wireless interface, commonly referred to as the Common Air Interface, and this has been functionally complete for some time. In addition to the wireless interface, there are 10 other interfaces or connection points for a Project 25 system that are identified for standardization. The progress on the remaining interfaces are in various stages of development and driven by current market needs. There are a growing number of industry participants that continue the work necessary to complete and maintain a full set of documents for each of the 11 interfaces. Since the Project 25 standard was first adopted by the FCC in 2001, 36 states have deployed statewide P25 networks, as have 165 cities and county. In total, nearly 70% of the U.S. population is covered by a public safety Project 25 network. Practically speaking, the widespread adoption of the P25 standard has allowed for interoperability regardless of state or local boundaries. Motorola invented the police radio in 1930 and strives towards total customer satisfaction. When a first responder orders a public safety radio and network, Motorola does not simply perform the installation and walk away. We continue to work to ensure the equipment performs as advertised, as intended. This includes testing to validate interoperability with P25 equipment from other manufacturers. Motorola understands there are life-threatening consequences if equipment fails to function as intended. Motorola has an open-door policy that allows any manufacturer to test P25 standards-based features with our P25 networks. Motorola also participates in the DHS testing program. In adherence to the NIST guidelines, Motorola has posted the compliance testing results for our entire Project 25 portfolio of products on the Responder knowledge base. Significant progress has been made with respect to the development of Project 25 standards. The original Project 25 goals created by public safety community have been met, and additional standards works continues for new technologies and features. In order to maintain an efficient P25 standards process, it is important to maintain a diverse group of users, as Project 25 covers federal, state, county, and local users. These users include law enforcement, fire, police, and EMS services. It is just as critical to include industry representation in these discussions, as industry writes the standards, they build to the standards, and they do the testing to the standards. Through the consensus process, this group ensures that there are agreed upon common goals supported by the user organizations and industry. These goals are properly prioritized so that all participants have a common set of objectives. Once those priorities are set, this Project 25 group must sustain focus on the task at hand until it is complete. By keeping these basic steps top of mind during the standards process, we can continue to meet the needs of public safety in a timely manner. Project 25, which is focused primarily on mission-critical voice, is not the end of the interoperability story. Public safety users are demanding high-bandwidth applications and content to facilitate greater intelligence and information sharing between local, state, and federal agencies. Motorola believes that it is imperative that the Congress act to dedicate the D-block spectrum for public safety broadband. This will provide public safety with enough spectrum to deploy broadband networks in addition to the existing Project 25 mission-critical voice networks capable of meeting the public safety demand for the foreseeable future. Again, I want to thank you for holding this hearing on an issue critical to public safety in this country. Interoperability saves lives, and Motorola remains committed to building the mission-critical communications equipment first responders have trusted for 80 years. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Chief Johnson, please proceed.
Thank you, Chairman Wu and Ranking Member Smith. My name is Jeff Johnson. I'm the Fire Chief at Tualatin Valley Fire and Rescue, President of the International Association of Fire Chiefs, and for 8 years have been Chairman of the Oregon Wireless Interoperable Network. I was looking forward to today's testimony. I'd like to begin my testimony this morning, sir, with a working definition of interoperability. It is the ability for public safety responders to communicate with staff from other responding agencies and to exchange voice and data communications on demand when authorized in real time. And while interoperability is very important, mission-critical operability is of greater importance, because without operability there is no interoperability. The majority of America's 30,000 plus fire departments operate with analog radios. Digital radios, available now for about 20 years, are being used by a growing number of jurisdictions today. When these radios began entering the public safety market, a standard known as P25 began development and is still in process. P25 ensures a common standard of performance features and a common air interface to allow interoperability between the radios produced by different manufacturers. This P25 standard is key to mission-critical operability and interoperability, and has long been fully supported by the International Association of Fire Chiefs. The P25 digital standard is actually a complex suite of standards which define the interface for radio consoles, base stations, and other system components. However, we in the fire service are not so much interested in how radio systems work, but that they work. We are pleased that the manufacturers are working with NIST and DHS, and that 4 of the major manufacturers now meet CAP requirements. It has taken a very long time to get to this point. I am pleased we're here, but we need to complete the P25 standard in the interest of assuring public safety that the digital radios they buy will indeed work interoperably. I'd like to end my presentation this morning with a glimpse of the future as we see it, which is all about interoperability and communication standards. The International Association of Fire Chiefs is working diligently with other public safety leadership organizations to build out a nationwide public safety interoperable wireless broadband network. This is the future for public safety communications and is vitally necessary. One of the major difficulties today in achieving interoperability is trying to connect, at great expense I might add, the thin slices of disparate spectrum which have been allocated by the FCC over the years to public safety as each new band has become available. In effect, we're building sideways connector roads to the lanes of spectrum which have been allocated to public safety and adding no meaningful forward throughput. The envisioned broadband system needs to be mission critical at the outset. At first, it will support data and video communications. In time, the goal of the IFC and its allies is to use this network for mission-critical voice communications. To achieve this goal, the D block of spectrum is vital to developing this robust network. To achieve this goal, we must move forward on the D block and must hasten the transition from the current land mobile radio communications to a mission-critical voice over Internet protocol system. Our quest for the D block is a one-time opportunity to make sure that the inadequate spectrum we have today is moved to a larger, more robust and comprehensive broadband network and create a national architecture of Internet protocol for public safety. Recently, the FCC announced in its national broadband plan that it will auction the D block to commercial interests without the needed public safety requirements. Thus, public safety seeks passage of legislation to allocate the D block directly to the Public Safety Spectrum Trust. House Resolution 5081, introduced by Representative Peter King, is currently before the House and Commerce Committee. The bipartisan legislation has the strong support of both public safety leadership and major national organizations representing state, county, and local government. Our collective message is simple. The D block is virtually needed by public safety to ensure an efficient broadband system which will attract commercial interest and reduce the need for government funding. This is our only path to solving interoperability long-term, once and for all. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the opportunity to appear before you and this committee on this very important subject. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Chief Johnson. And now it is in order for the panel to ask questions, and the chair recognizes himself for 5 minutes. Mr. Orr, in your written testimony, you raise a point that only a limited portion of the Program 25 system, or P25 system, is truly standards-based. What's the practical impact of that statement?
Standards, at the most basic, are a blueprint to allow multiple manufacturers to build product in a similar way, which will allow those products to interoperate. In the absence of that blueprint, in the absence of those standards, you cannot have that common implementation that allows interoperability, and therefore you cannot have open competition and you cannot have multi-vendor interoperability in the field. That's the impact of the lack of standards in this situation, is that the standards that remain undefined in Project 25 make it difficult for a common implementation to occur, which will increase the likelihood of non-interoperability in the field and increases the difficulty of open competition.
So, Mr. Orr, what you're saying is that lack of completeness of those standards has an impact on competition levels and also on safety for emergency responders.
Absolutely.
Are any of the panelists or any of the witnesses aware of any situation in recent years where public safety folks using P25 labeled systems and believing them to be compliant were unable to communicate with other first responders using P25 systems? And if so, do you know what caused that to happen? In no particular order. Dr. Boyd.
Our experience, both at 911 and at Katrina, was that systems which were labeled P25, where the interpretation of the standard had deviated a little bit between manufacturers, meant they couldn't communicate directly. But probably the best single example we have is the testing we did among systems which were in the field. And the important element there is that it tells you that there are lots of systems in the field that were labeled P25 that, because of those minor variations in interpretation, cannot communicate with each other, sometimes within one manufacturer's line. So what you have to worry about then is what happens if they're called on to provide mutual aid in another jurisdiction, because now they both have P25 systems, but they may not be able to communicate with each other because of minor as any engineer designs a system, he has to interpret what amounts to a text-based standard.
And that interpretation, if there's differing interpretation, that's where conformance testing and compliance testing, that's what those forms of tests can address? Is that?
Absolutely. The only way you arrive at common interpretation is the test. At the end of the day, a standard is not operationalized until there's a test.
Going back to any other examples of lack of communication between P25 labeled systems. Okay, very good. Mr. Muench, I'm not getting this quite right. You know, my high school German would tell me that that's Muench, but can you say it for me? Just
Mensch, bench with an M.
Bench. Thank you very much, sir.
Sure.
Mr. Muench, in your testimony, you said that the technical specifications for P25 Phase 1 systems are functionally complete. Can you explain that to us, what you mean by that?
Yes. Functionally complete means that there's enough information in the standard for manufacturers to build product and deploy product, actually do interoperability testing with other manufacturers. As I said in my testimony, there has been over 1 million units sold of Project 25, all participate within interoperability testing throughout the informal programs that Motorola has within our facility in Schaumburg.
Well, I don't know if this is in comparison or in contrast or the same thing, but Dr. Boyd, in your testimony, you state that comprehensive standards do not yet exist. Can you explain to us what you mean by that?
Right now, there are 4 primary components we're concerned with. They're things like the Common Air Interface, things like the ISSI standard. Those standards, while they've been tested at some level, are not really fully complete and have not yet been accepted entirely by the community. So until the final vote comes out and a test is developed, some tests are already in place, and a test is developed, no standard is complete, because at the end of the day, it is the test that determines whether variations in interpretation are creating an interoperability problem.
Now, my time has expired, but I don't know if we have a disagreement here or not. Can we have Harris and Motorola on one hand and DHS and NIST on the other hand? Can you address whether there is a difference of opinion about this?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Speaking for Harris, I think we have 50 systems deployed, and we have systems that have different vendor radios. We have a system that was deployed with none of our radios. And we've achieved the full level of the customer satisfaction in daily operations with those systems. We have interoperated with Motorola systems, as John just said. We've gone to Schaumburg to test during our development as an assurance. This is informal developments that have been developed during time. They've come to our lab and testing their developments. So over the last few years, we've actually developed a more cooperative relationship in the industry. I believe the standards are functionally complete, as John said. We've implemented to them. We've tested them. Now, are the last little bits of the standards complete? I think the Common Air Interface is very solid. I think the baseline ISSI, which is coming out, is very solid. The console interface is a subset of that. That's a little bit in the future. The fixed station interface, I believe, is very solid. Products are starting to emerge to that. So I actually think the picture is a little bit better than our colleagues here would present in fielded systems.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm trying to myself get a grasp of how widespread the problem is. Dr. Boyd, you mentioned that within one manufacturer, one product is not compatible with another or interoperable with another?
Yeah, in fairness to the manufacturers, and I want to shoot at the manufacturers, remember that this process started in 1989. That's 21 years ago. So manufacturers' equipment that was produced as P25 compliant in many instances before and were labeled as P25 compliant in many cases long before any of these interfaces were really finished, often didn't communicate with other manufacturers or even with newer equipment, because both Motorola and Harris and others, for example, have increasingly applied more and more stringent applications in order to make sure that this equipment comes closer to those standards. It's important, though, I think, to remember that while P25, I think one way to picture how well things are going is in 2008, when Congress finally authorized the development of the Compliance Assessment Program, that really started the ball rolling that we had started in 1989 at a time before Bluetooth and before people texted and all those kinds of things. And now we're looking at a real compliance test probably in 2 more years. That's an amazing change over time. But I think what you have to remember is that this development over time is something that's reflected, I think, in one of my colleagues.
Are you saying that it might have been interoperable at one point, but maybe not as interoperable today as it once was?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, it's important to remember there are legacy systems out there that aren't going to be changed out for a long time.
So what is the solution there? I mean, how are we any better off today with a standard or hopefully not a mandate that would paint a picture that is ultimately going to change due to industry coming up with a better way of doing things that meets the standard at one point, you know, the previous standard, but yet throws in a few other bells and whistles along the way?
The way we talk about standards is that there ought to be some core set of functionalities that we make sure remain in place. Otherwise, what happens if we don't have
Are we without those today?
I think we're getting close to having those. But if we don't have those, then every new generation moves away from that and creates exactly the same problem we've been trying to fix. I think the manufacturers are working very closely with us now to develop that core set of functionalities. That's why things like
that's in the best interest of everyone involved.
Absolutely.
Even if it might lead to a profit that I think is a good thing. Sometimes I wonder around this place, but when we get to the larger issue here, I just hope that we don't have the heavy hand of government establishing a mandate that ultimately I think will shut down innovation. Can you assure me that that's not going to happen?
Well, I would hope not. I think that both the challenge and the strength of the standards process in the U.S. Are kind of interesting. The challenge is that consensus is probably best spelled S-L-O-W. The strength is it makes sure everybody gets heard. It makes sure we leave open potential for innovation as the standards are developed. But it also puts us on a road, on a path so that we don't have lots of diverging paths. We have paths that allow innovation that move in the same direction so the road gets wider. It doesn't diverge.
Okay, I appreciate that. That's actually a good analogy. Now, from an agency perspective, Chief Johnson, if you could tell me or tell us how you would go about verifying the interoperability of a particular product. Do you have to do that only after you purchase it? How do you verify?
Well, I think the assessment that most public safety officers look at whether it's P25 compliant or not and make their purchasing decision based upon that is pretty accurate. Very, very few departments, individual departments, possess the individual ability to test the compliance of their system. Plus, even if you bought it thinking it was compliant on day one, it doesn't mean that the radio network that you use couldn't change out to a different manufacturer a year later, or that your mutual aid agency that you're running into changes theirs. And I think that illustrates why it's so important to make sure that compliance assessment testing is done and that it's accurate so that we can buy with confidence. I mean, let's face it, public safety wireless communication devices are expensive. But there's reasons they're expensive. They're largely bulletproof. They're intrinsically safe. They don't cause an explosion. They're waterproof. They are firefighter proof, and that's saying something. And I think we forget those elements that lead to the price of the product. And frankly, the public safety market's a pretty small market when you compare it to the BlackBerry market or some of the others. So
I just want them to be Congress-proof too. For the sake of the American people.
Thank you. But to a great extent, sir, we're relying on the certification.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Smith. Chief Johnson, you said that you're relying upon the certification. In essence, you're relying upon the representation that P25 is interoperable, that equipment labeled P25 is interoperable.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, that is correct. And I think also many of the grants today require that you purchase P25 equipment.
Well, I thought I heard earlier that sometimes P25 equipment won't talk with each other, that they're not truly interoperable, and that different generations of P25 equipment may not be interoperable. It seems to me that if it's not interoperable, one of the two systems it should not be labeled P25, so that Chief Johnson isn't misled that two items bearing a P25 sticker really works with each other.
Yeah, I think in fairness, because of the way the process is developed, I'm talking about systems that label themselves as P25, because there was no test process to say, in fact, it really does comply around these core functionalities like the common air interface or as they're completed all of these other interfaces. What we're after is a core set of functions. We want them to be able to develop lots of bells and whistles that go beyond that, capabilities that while they may early look like bells and whistles, later become necessities. I like to point at the cell phone, for example, that the cell phone in 1970 was hardly anybody's idea of a necessity. I would challenge that view today.
Now it's an entitlement, though.
Chief Johnson, given the knowledge that that the standards are arguably not complete, how much confidence do you and your colleagues have in those purchasing decisions without the certifications?
Mr. Chairman, I think most public safety responders trust the P25 standard and are purchasing them expecting reliable communication with other systems. And I think that's the current standard of field today.
So the confidence level is reasonably high, or do you have some residual concerns?
I think within our industry, the confidence level is reasonably high. But I think there is always the question mark of making sure that it operates cross-system. And that's why we reach out to our other colleagues. You know, fire chiefs reach out to other fire chiefs and police chiefs that may be operating similar types of equipment. And then we actually check with other chiefs to make sure that they're having a good experience with the products we're about to buy. And that's frankly the benefit of an association like the International Fire Chiefs is you can reach out to a large group. And candidly, I think this is true with the public in general. We're more likely to trust another fire chief's experience than we are the representation of the manufacturers. And that's just the state of the market in any product, not just in radio communications.
I'd like to ask the panel, and this is really aimed, I suppose, at the other four witnesses. What factors have delayed the development of technical standards, and what factors have delayed the implementation or of compliance or conformance tests in any particular order?
I think there are three major things that have delayed them, and I think they're all the kinds of things we're all working on. The first one is that it's a consensus process, and I think it ought to remain a consensus standard process, but that means it's slow. The second one is that the technology's changed pretty dramatically since we first started this in 1989. And so that means that we've had to make lots of adjustments as we develop the standard to take into account all of the other things that have been happening technologically, because the standard you would have designed in 1989 is not what you're going to design now. So the standards process probably is never going to be fully finished, but we can arrive at something that allows rational migration. And the third one is that there's a huge installed infrastructure that no community can afford to simply throw away. And we're going to have to keep that in mind as we implement any of these, that we can't implement technologies that have the effect of isolating communities that can't afford to buy into newer systems. And so we always have to think as we do this about how we keep those legacy systems able to communicate with the newer equipment. And I think the manufacturers, in fact, have done a pretty good job of developing some of those bridging technologies that permit that to happen.
Mr. Muench, Dr. Hofmeister?
I would actually say that the standards based on, since it is a voluntary process and it requires significant expertise in the area with the limited resources that in the industry, we have been moving along at a fairly good pace and keeping up with technology. We are just about to embark upon the second phase of the standard.
Now, it has been 21 years.
Absolutely, and we have significant progress. Over 70% of the U.S. population are covered by Project 25.
Well, covered by Project 25 is apparently is different from knowing that these P25 systems are actually fully interoperable or functional with each other.
Yeah, so maybe I can go back to the point that was made earlier. A lot of the general statements about interoperability issues, since 2005, we haven't had the reports that have come in about interoperability challenges. Motorola has investigated all of them, and the majority of the time, it's how the actual equipment is configured. This is a complex technology. This isn't like plug and play that you would have on your Apple computer. This takes, there's configuration of the equipment, there's the execution of the test or the pass and fail criteria that are set up. So some of the issues that have come up, and they've called them interoperability issues, are really configuration issues, and it has not related back to conformance or compliance to the standard.
Dr. Hofmeister and Mr. Orr, I want to give you a chance to address this, although my time has expired.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think, as I said in my testimony, in terms of the pace of the standard, since 2005, before 2005, or the gap between 1995 and 2005, things were pretty slow. Since 2005, the standards pace has picked up, and as I testified, I believe it's moving at the pace that which we have the capacity to support, with the number of engineers that have the capability and the quality to develop the standards. In terms of interoperability across these systems that are legacy systems, I will say the interop testing that's going now under P25 CAP and the posting of S-stocks, these systems are complex. Every system that you test against has a hardware revision number, a software revision number, whether that's infrastructure or your radio, and you need to make sure that those are known. Now, as a result of that process, both Harris and Motorola, and we release software releases about every 6 months or so. We have then an obligation to tell the radio manufacturers whose radios are operating our system, look, we're having this new release. We don't think it's going to affect anything, but you might want to check to make sure that your radios operate this way. So I think we're going to get much better going forward, so we won't have this issue that maybe there are generations of the product in the field.
Thank you. Mr. Orr, would you care to address this topic before we go to Mr. Smith?
Sure, Mr. Chairman. I think I'd like to point out something, which is I understand that the consensus process can be slow and it can be cumbersome. Simply, building consensus is difficult. However, I think it needs to be pointed out, and what's important in this case is that it has been since 1989 that we've gotten to the state where we are, where we have 1.5 of the 8 interfaces complete. In that same period of time, since 1989, we've had 2G cellular standards developed, systems deployed, 3G cellular standards developed, systems deployed, 4G cellular standards developed, and now systems are being deployed. So standards don't have to be slow. The standards process doesn't have to be slow. In addition to that, every one of those wireless technologies, cellular, Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, as an industry, knew that it is imperative as an industry to be successful in that deployment of that technology was to wrap an incredibly rigorous compliance assessment program around it. So every single one of those technologies has an industry-led compliance assessment and certification program. P25 is the only one that I'm aware of that has not done that in a major wireless industry. So I think the key is here that it doesn't have to take forever, but we do need to move the process forward, and we do need to complete the first suite of standards.
Does anyone know why P25 is uniquely different in this respect?
I don't really think it's uniquely different. I think the only complexity for P20, and it's not for P25, for interoperability in general, is that there's so much legacy gear there. But P25 looks to the future. It's what we're going to be doing as we build out new equipment and put it into place. So I really don't think ultimately that it's uniquely different. I think there hasn't been a lot of focus on it. I know the first time we started working on interoperability some time ago when I was in the Justice Department back in 1993, there wasn't a whole lot of interest other than in public safety. And even then, in those days, when we were trying to fund the development of P25, it was a very slow, very cumbersome process. I can't say that folks were energized in the same way they have been since 9/11 and Katrina.
Just a comment on the question you asked. I believe a difference is the scale of the industry. This, by any sense, is a fairly small, specialized industry. The scale of people involved, the scale of income, the scale of R&D, the scale that can be devoted to development of standards, in my view, is much different than the commercial industry, where you're selling millions of these things. We're selling thousands of these radios and so on. So I believe the scale makes a difference in the amount of resources that can be devoted to the development of standards.
Thank you. Apologies, Mr. Smith. Please proceed.
Thank you. I'm just trying to, again, get a grasp of what all takes place here. Now, in terms of meeting P25 standards, Mr. Muench, could you mention what takes place in meeting those standards?
Well, first, the industry participates in the standards development process, actually defining the technical definitions and producing the documents required for standardization to be published by a recognized standards development organization. This also includes the actual tests to validate the compliance to the standard. Once that standard is published, then manufacturers build the products in adherence to the standard. We go through rigorous testing through our development process, and then once our products are complete and ready to deploy out in the market, we do interoperability testing, not only with ourselves, but with other manufacturers to ensure that we have the Product 25 interoperability. So when we deploy these products, they're not going to have any issues. Then beyond that, there's external programs such as the Compliance Assessment Program by DHS that provides an either further confidence that the products that have been manufactured and are beginning to be deployed are compliant to the Project 25 standard.
So when you say testing, can you give us, I mean, especially in light of what Dr. Hofmeister said, we're not talking about the same number as we have cell phones, and so obviously the whole bus there moves a little
right.
slowly.
Right.
So, but in terms of testing, what is placed on industry in terms of the burden of testing?
At this point in time, beyond the DHS CAP program, industry itself does the testing on its own within our internal labs because the end goal here is total customer satisfaction. We don't want to have an issue where public safety lives are in danger because a product doesn't work, regardless of manufacturer. We understand the mission critical aspect of our business.
Okay, and so moving forward, what do you think should or should not be done so that perhaps there's the flexibility necessary for industry to innovate and yet sustain the necessary functions of communication?
Thank you. Good question. I think things are going along relatively good right now. When we look at external programs and supporting these external programs, again, to Dr. Hofmeister's comments on the scale of the industry, we would prefer to have a wider breadth of external testing as opposed to depth. And when I talk about depth of testing, it's do you really want to know if the ones and zeros are in the right place in your message, or do you want to ensure that the "can you hear me now" between different manufacturers works? And that's the ultimate, in Motorola's view, that's the ultimate test, is when you get out in the field and multiple manufacturers are able to talk to each other on the radio system. And inherently, by providing interoperability testing, you are testing the other aspects such as conformance, which industry continues to do internal in their development.
Okay. Anyone else wishing to elaborate? Mr. Orr?
I think to follow up to John's comments, first of all, those ones and zeros can be incredibly important to determine whether or not when you hit the emergency button on the radio, whether the emergency alarm on the radio goes off or not. So the ones and zeros in a radio and implementing the protocol that is published in the standard is critical, because that was built to do a certain function. So you have to follow the protocol to get the functionality that's expected. So checking the ones and zeros is important. But I think, Mr. Smith, you bring up a very important issue, which is understanding what burden this may place on industry. And that's something we've taken very seriously from the very beginning. We realize that any additional testing that's placed upon industry is going to cost money. And so we've done everything within this program to ensure that we are minimizing the burden on industry, minimizing the financial requirements that are needed to put the program in place. But our threshold at any moment has to be that we can look a fireman or a policeman in the eye and tell them we've created a program that will give them the confidence necessary so that when they hit the button on that radio, that it's going to do what it's supposed to do. Every wireless industry knows in a multi-vendor environment that problems can occur. Find those problems in the lab. Do not find them in the field.
Now, when you say confidence, is there confidence lacking in the field today?
Yes, because right now the traditional testing in Project 25 until the compliance assessment program was developed was manufacturer testing in their own individual laboratories, and the P25 logo stating that that manufacturer themselves believe that they have implemented the P25 standard in a way that is consistent with the protocol. In every other wireless industry, you have to take your radio to a third-party lab, have it certified by a third-party body to get a logo that says that you're going to actually interoperate in the field. That is a level of confidence that we're used to in Bluetooth devices, Wi-Fi devices, cellular devices. That's the kind of confidence that public safety is assuming and wanting in that P25 logo that just doesn't exist.
That's not necessarily a government agency, that certifying agency, or is it?
No, it's not a government agency. And in all of those industry cases, that's industry itself creating a body to do that in all of those other industry cases.
So we've got the masses that are, the numbers are quite different. Is that?
The numbers are different, but the end result and the need for the same end result, which is interoperability and proper functionality, is not different.
Okay. Chief Johnson, do you feel that there's confidence lacking in the field?
Mr. Smith, you know, I don't have any personal knowledge that there's widespread lack of confidence. I don't dispute his observations, and probably the reason for that is that most of the systems I'm familiar with are purchased through a request for proposal and a competitive bid process, and the procurement process in and of itself requires that the compliance testing at the end of it demonstrates that it's working and it's operable across the system. So it's very common for us to say, I'm looking for this kind of a system, and you don't get your money until you prove that it works. So I think that kind of an environment reduces my exposure to people that may be lacking confidence, but I wouldn't dispute his observation.
Back to Mr. Muench, there's been mention of other products, other wireless products that are subject to a third-party review. Obviously, your company makes a lot of items that probably would be subject to those third-party reviews. Can you tell us the difference? What can we take away from that for the good of this discussion?
Absolutely. To Dereck's point on compliance testing, we believe that compliance testing is vital to making sure that you've developed to the standard. The real issue is, do you need to do these tests outside of the development testing, or do you need to validate them within development? That's really what it comes down to. Motorola does the testing today, and the litmus test, or how Motorola determines whether this is important to share with customers, is when customers go out to RFP, right, request the type of testing, the tests that they require are interoperability tests. Customers can come to us today and ask for, before we give you our money, we want to see your conformance tests. And Motorola would be happy to. We just haven't had those requests from our customers, outside the process for that level of detail. So again, we look to the market, in this case, the public safety market, to request that of industry.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I thought the chief said that that as part of the process that compliance testing it is always asked for, and Mr. Muench, I thought you said that conformance tests aren't performed because customers don't ask for it. What am I not understanding here?
No, so industry absolutely does conformance testing during the development process. That's when you're developing the software.
Mr. Muench or Mr. Orr, can you explain to me later on the difference between developmental tests and, if you will, tests after the development
assessment
process?
tests? Yes. Correct. Yes.
Go ahead with your answer.
I was just going to say Motorola absolutely supports and does compliance testing during the development process to make sure that we adhere and are compliant to the Project 25 standard as written. Motorola writes the actual conformance tests and publishes them along with the other industry within the P25 TIA process. So we have those conformance tests. We run those conformance tests. The issue is once we develop a product, if there hasn't been a need for that to increase confidence around conformance. The customers are looking for confidence around interoperability because that makes sure that the emergency button, when it's pushed on our system, goes through every time, and that can be done through a interoperability test with other manufacturers. And we do that within our testing labs before we release products. We also do them when customers come to pick up their systems and test them within our factory. We'll bring other manufacturers' radios in, and they can go and push the emergency button, make sure it goes through and gets through.
Mr. Orr, would you care to address this issue and also the emergency button or distress button issue, whether there is a problem or is an issue there?
Sure, and if you would like, I can address the development versus interop issue as well, if you would like now too as well.
Yeah, go ahead.
I think the issue has come up in the past in discussing how to implement the compliance assessment program. The question has been, when does the testing have to occur? The manufacturers, as Mr. Muench has stated, believe that they already do the testing in their development phase, so why do they want to retest the equipment again after development phase? We've recognized that, and we've actually reached out to all the manufacturers and said we are happy to allow the compliance assessment program to wrap into the development phase so that you can do that testing in development and count that as your compliance assessment. You just have to wrap the quality system around it and have auditing paperwork. You have to have the right equipment doing the testing. That equipment has to have been proven to actually work correctly. The test equipment does. So you can do certain things, but count the tests going on in development as your compliance assessment program, a compliance assessment test. So we want to work with the manufacturers to make this work for them. That is our goal. We want this to work, but we want to have a successful program. As to the issue of conformance tests versus interoperability tests, I think a very important point needs to be made here. Again, and I hate to belabor this point, every other wireless industry believes that conformance and interoperability tests are necessary to ensure interoperability in the field. Not one or the other, both. They're not, it's not take one, take the other, it's take both. The other issue for us that I think is incredibly important for cost purposes is that interoperability testing simply tests whether manufacturer A's works with manufacturer B's product. You cannot infer that because A works with B, that A works with C. You have to test A to C. That's the only way an interoperability test proves that something works. Conformance tests looks at one main...
Let me ask you.
Sure.
So if I have a product and I can talk with you, Mr. Orr, and you have a product and Mr. Smith has a product and you can talk with Mr. Smith, and even though they're both P25 compliant, it may be that Mr. Smith and I cannot talk with each other, even though we can and you can, but Mr. Smith and I cannot communicate.
Absolutely, and an interoperability test would, if you and I and Mr. Smith and I were the only ones that did an interoperability test.
Well, that was the gist of my question earlier. If that is the case, shouldn't one of our radios be required to have the P25 sticker removed?
Well, and that's the importance of conformance test. How do you know who's not conforming? There's a couple of cases that could have occurred here. One is one of the people making the radios didn't conform to the protocol document, so somebody's not P25 compliant. There's another completely legitimate scenario, which is both are complying with the protocol document, which means the protocol document itself has a problem and needs to be addressed. Those are legitimate issues that can exist in any standards body, and that's why these kind of programs are put in place. Now, one more point, if I may, I want to make about interoperability testing. Because it requires me to test against every manufacturer, the permutations of tests against all the manufacturers becomes quite large. Our program only requires a manufacturer to test against 3 other manufacturers. We don't require them to test against every other manufacturer, because what happens is with every new version and firmware revision that comes out years and years down the line, that would mean you'd have to do interoperability testing back with every existing system that's still in the field. If you get 10 years down the line, you'd be looking at 8,000 interoperability tests. That is financially impossible. Conformance testing allows each individual manufacturer to prove adherence to the standard and traceability of the standard without testing against another product in the field, another product in the market.
Mr. Muench, you're not opposed to conformance testing?
Absolutely not. We do it. We perform it today.
Mr. Smith?
So I guess I'm still unclear. You're saying that A and B might be compatible, but A and C aren't users. So how do you go about requiring and mandating tests without having this huge burden that you just said you can't go back to thousands of other points, unless I'm missing something?
So how do you find out whether A or B or A or C is implementing correctly? Is that what I guess? Well, there's 2 things you have to do to improve the confidence that it's going to work in the field, in the labs. One is you have each manufacturer run the tests that show that they've implemented the standard correctly, the protocol. They've done it right. They look at the ones and zeros and make sure they're in the right order, they're in the right place, they've all met the standard correctly. You then do a series of interoperability tests to increase the confidence that people are implementing correctly. But what we have not done is said you have to go out and do interoperability testing against every other manufacturer because of the permutations of tests required and because of the financial burden that would place on the industry.
Basically what you're doing is what amounts to a statistical series of tests. When you add the second test, I can't be certain that my triangle works. When I add the third test, I dramatically increase the likelihood that you'll be able to communicate with lots of other systems in addition to the 3 we talked to. There's a point when testing against more and more systems provides very, very small diminishing returns. It's just the reality that I am far less likely to have a conformance problem that creates an issue once I've tested 3 or 4 systems. I don't have to test 1,000 systems.
Okay.
But if you test against a standard, you don't have to guess about the number. You don't have to do 3 to interpret that 5 also works. If you test against a standard, then you know that it works.
That's exactly right.
Okay. Well, I'm still trying to get a grasp of how urgent this situation is, and because I want to be sensitive to the use of public funds, taxpayer dollars, that are oftentimes in huge amounts, and having served at the local government level, I mean these are big hits to a budget, and you want it to be effectively spent, and also have the opportunity in the future to acquire, maybe some updates and things like that work and build even greater confidence. So, Dr. Boyd, Mr. Orr, on a scale of 1 to 10, what's the urgency for taking action? 10 being extremely urgent.
I'd say it approaches 10. And the reason I say that is the reason this whole program started is because the public safety community, the first responders, kept asking us, how do we know what works and what we ought to invest our very, very precious, in particular, grant money on, so that we don't end up in 3 years behind the 8 ball because the standards that were going to be required as part of the grant process now creates a new issue for us. And that all ties back to, do these grants work or not? In fact, I think it actually helps industry, because by providing that confidence to first responders, they're much more likely now to begin to free up and make those investments, and they don't get challenged nearly as much by county commissions or city councils, who are understandably very concerned that their first responders not buy into a system that's going to turn out to not be interoperable in 3 years.
Right. Okay. So you say it's extremely urgent that action be taken. Mr. Orr, same.
I agree completely with Dr. Boyd.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Ms. Biggert, would you care to ask a question?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'm sorry I missed the testimony. So I understand that you all have been discussing, and I'm a little bit what I wanted to ask, and I'm sorry I missed that, but I am from Illinois, and I know, Dr. Hofmeister, you work with Naperville, which is in my district, and Mr. Muench, Motorola has been a longstanding company in Illinois, both do fine jobs. So I just wanted to ask you both, does there need to be an industry-led formal compliance assessment program in place, as Mr. Orr has testified, or does either of your companies offer your facilities to other vendors to validate interoperability across multi-vendor products platforms prior to formal interoperable testing under DHS and NIST guidelines?
Yes, thank you for the question. Certainly, Harris, as I think I mentioned earlier, has an interoperability lab in our facility in Lynchburg, Virginia. As a result of putting that together for the compliance assessment program, we also offer that for informal testing of other radio vendors to come in. Motorola has been there testing some products they're developing in terms of data part. We've been to their facility. So, yes, that is happening, and we fully support that. To your first question, whether it should be an industry-led compliance assessment effort, sort of on the scale, I think, of what other industries are doing, I guess we at Harris have a hard time thinking about that because of the size and scale of the industry. We just can't afford to do everything to the scale that cellular and other industries do. We have to make the best judgments we can. I think the P25 compliance assessment program that's in place is moving in that direction. As earlier, we support conformance testing, as Mr. Muench mentioned, during product development. We're less supportive of doing that, repeating that testing afterwards, but we're trying to work through the issues with Mr. Orr and others to make sure that we meet those requirements. So I just think if you take a Wi-Fi system or something like that, and you do an industry, I think WiMAX, for example, I believe it costs somewhere in the neighborhood of $100,000 to $300,000 to put your product through that testing. That's a scale. If you set that up, we just can't. We don't believe the industry can support that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Muench, care to comment?
Thank you. Yes, Motorola absolutely supports the informal testing. We have a lab set up. We visit the other manufacturers' labs. So very similar to Dr. Hofmeister, what he just spoke of. As far as the first question, and the industry that we work in is fairly small. There's 13 manufacturers, and I can tell you from the DHS compliance assessment program, we've had 10 of the 13 manufacturers participate in our interoperability testing, and it's referenced on our supplier declaration of compliance that's loaded up onto the DHS site. So I think participation is very good. I think confidence level is fairly high. So at this point in time, I don't believe that a formal program led by industry is necessary.
Do you work with other manufacturers in your testing, or do you rely solely on your internal tests?
No, we absolutely work with other manufacturers.
Is it possible that a communication device could pass the test but fail to interoperate seamlessly with vendor's product?
Yeah, in the extreme case where a manufacturer either didn't have the expertise or was trying deliberately not to conform, yes. The experience that we have had with deploying product, we have not come across that yet. The industry, we have a good working relationship with each other, and it's in our best interest, all of our best interests, to make sure that these products interoperate together as specified in the Project 25 standard.
Thank you very much. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I think what I just heard is some concern about a formal compliance testing process. In the written testimony, there was testimony to the fact that the European standard, TETRAS, requires a formal testing process, and that American manufacturers which sell in Europe actually go through this compliance testing process. What distinguishes what distinguishes the approach that you take in Europe, where there is this testing, versus your position here in the United States?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The first point is that it's actually mandated by the EU that you perform this level of testing, which right now the tests are over 300 tests and take a significant amount of time to get product, certified through that process. The concern here would be that by putting those rigorous tests and that amount of, as I said, depth into the testing in a formal process, and again looking at the permutations of how many products you bring to market as well as the number of manufacturers, you could slow down the adoption of Project 25 and actually create larger barriers of entry to smaller companies.
But if we heard concerns about the cost of testing, and yet you still find it worthwhile to be in the European market where this testing has to be performed.
Absolutely. We support standards that are defined by their marketplace, and that was the marketplace that it was defined in.
Dr. Hofmeister or Mr. Orr?
I'm sorry, just a quick comment on the Tetra testing. Yes, so we understand that. We don't actually participate in that market with the Tetra testing, but we do sense that there's some second thoughts in that marketplace, and they're sort of thinking, and there's some sensitivity to the cost. And there's one document that we've seen, a recommendation that you actually combine, do conformance testing along with interoperability. You do interoperability testing and do some conformance monitoring as part of that to maybe help reduce the impact. And that's something we've talked about with Mr. Orr and the colleagues about maybe that's something that we could consider as a way of doing interoperability testing and doing conformance monitoring as part of that process. Thank you.
Any comments from either Mr. Orr or Dr. Boyd?
I would just like to reiterate, we certainly looked at the Tetra model. We heard loud and clear the manufacturers in Project 25's concerns about the costs. And like I said before, we have truly tried in every way possible to make this as least burdensome a process on the U.S. manufacturers. We do not want to negatively impact the U.S. manufacturers. We do want to create a higher level of confidence for our public safety users that the products are going to work when they're in the field and they need those radios to work. So I do want to make that very clear. And I also would like to make the point that I think both of these companies have pointed out in the past, it was the compliance assessment program itself that really started to open up these multi-manufacturer laboratories and create the atmosphere where multiple manufacturers began to travel to other manufacturers' labs and test within them. So it has had a beneficial impact, but we do pay attention to their concerns, and we continue to work with them to make this a beneficial but cost-reducing program.
Yeah, I think that's an important point, that the program very consciously decided that we ought to use existing manufacturers' laboratories, not invent a new federal laboratory to drive all of this, but in fact use what already existed in industry. And that's really a foundation piece of the model.
Thank you. I believe, Mr. Smith, you have some further questions.
Let me ask Chief Johnson, scale of 1 to 10 on urgency for action in terms of where we are today and what needs to be done. A scale of 1 to 10, how urgent is this?
Thank you, Mr. Smith. This is not pursuing this where we are in the Project 25 standard has not been my primary area of study, so I really do not have a feel for it, sir. I think reflecting back on my comment about how in public safety we make sure that we're buying compliant product, I think the larger the purchase, the larger the scale, and the more likely you are to use a request for proposal bid system where you can hold people accountable on the back end for functional testing, the safer you are as a public safety responder. If you buy 1 or 2 radios, you're more subject to the certification and having to trust the certification. I think to reiterate a component of my testimony, and I really appreciate where the committee is coming from in this regard, is at the end of the day, I think it's unreasonable to expect a police chief or a fire chief to be conversant enough in the technical details. And I think you basically want to be able to look at a standard and trust that that standard says it'll work from provider to provider to provider in case you're not doing an RFP-based system where you can actually test it a field.
Chief, it's awfully hard for a congressman to be conversant in this area also.
Thank you.
Hear, hear. Thank you, Chief. On the European model, then, is that a more desirable situation, Dr. Boyd?
I don't think we want a mandated system that, in fact, is very, very government-heavy and very, very government-driven, and quite frankly, is much more expensive than anything we think is really appropriate to put into place here. I think we want the kind of voluntary consensus-based assessment program that we have.
Okay. Mr. Orr, is a European model more desirable than what we have now?
No, I believe what I'd like to see happen is for the program we have in place to become fully functional. And if that meets the requirements and we see what in the field what needs to happen, and the result is that we have equipment that meets the standard and we don't have any significant problems in the field, then the program's working and there's no reason to do anything more than that.
Okay. Dr. Hofmeister, would tetra testing be the reason Harris is not in Europe?
No, I don't think that's a full reason. I think it's just a full business reason. That would be a component, but not
contributing factor.
A contributing factor, but not a full reason. Right.
Okay. Anyone else wishing to weigh in? Thank you.
If none of the members of the committee or subcommittee have any further questions, I like to offer folks this opportunity because you all have come a long ways and also done a lot of preparation for this hearing. So if there's anything that we have not asked but you would like to contribute to this hearing, I'd like to give you an opportunity going from left to right to add that now. Dr. Boyd?
Okay, just one brief point, and that's to remember that while we've been talking about land mobile radio, that the movement of the world into a digital arena means that we're now really talking about interoperability across all of these digital systems. And so over the long haul, we have to remember that as we look at interoperability, we've got to think beyond just voice into data, maps, imagery, video, and all the rest that public safety requires in large-scale emergencies like so many of those we've unfortunately seen in the last few years.
Mr. Orr?
I would simply end on the fact that I would point out that over the last few months, like I said in my testimony, we've been having some healthy discussions with our industry partners in Project 25, and we're moving forward and deciding what are the appropriate interoperability performance and conformance tests for each of the existing interfaces right now. And I feel confident, and I want to remain confident that when we report back to the committee at some point that we will have seen progress and moved forward in this issue. But I think the momentum over the last few months has been a positive one.
Dr. Hofmeister.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a couple points that didn't come out and were in my written testimony in terms of recommendations. One, there's an array of mandatory and standard option features that are part of this package. One suggestion would be to get the user community and manufacturers to work together to define those into packages, baseline, level 0, baseline level 1, so that you could refer to them as packages and not have to constantly refer to a whole array of these things. I think that would help with simplification of what it's compliant with and what the functionality is. But even more important to that, and it gets back to Dr. Boyd's testimony, the interoperability, again, to define levels of interoperability from very baseline, level 0, what functions are required there, level 1, and make sure those are rock solid. Right now, I think the users, we haven't, that's work's going on there, but I think there could be much progress in making sure that you define what those levels of interoperability are and make sure those are present, tested for, and present in every product. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Muench.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, I'd just like to reiterate that significant progress has been made in Project 25, and we continue to stay up with technology, maybe making it look like we're not making progress, but we continue to adopt new technology. As we move forward, Motorola actually absolutely supports the formal compliance assessment program, but we would just like to make sure that industry representation is part of that process. Since it is industry that is the ones that write the standards, we're the ones that develop the equipment, manufacture the equipment, and actually perform the testing. So again, having these industry experts as part of the process and providing, the recommendations, we've been making a lot of progress as of late, and we're going to continue to make progress.
That's a good thing. Thank you, Mr. Muench. And, these are consensus standards developed by multiple parties, mostly private industry, and my understanding is that underwriter laboratories and such testing efforts are also joint ventures of private industry. Thank you. Chief Johnson?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. We've spent a great deal of time today talking about the technical standards and how functional the radio system is. As Oregon's governor asked me to solve Oregon's interoperability problem, I found myself in front of the House and the Senate trying to explain what the national standard was for interoperability in a radio network. And it was then that I discovered there wasn't one, that there was no national recommendation for a radio network. And I think that part of our problem are, of course, the technical matters we talked about today, but that's only one of the swaths in terms of solving interoperability. And I think what we need next to truly move past our interoperability challenges in this country is we need a predictable national architecture for public safety communications. And that means that we combine the public safety broadband spectrum, which is allocated today, with the D block. And that will create an adequate enough swath that we can foresee and predict that public safety will move into what I'll call a radio over internet protocol. And OEC has actually identified this in their dual path strategy about moving from this land mobile radio based environment that we have today, moving out of, frankly, there's still systems out there today operating on crystal radios and many systems operating on stamped chipsets, to moving to an internet protocol driven radio system. Now this will take time. Moving from LMR today to IP radio is going to take many, many years. But it is the only way to identify a national architecture that will draw industry to a common place and give fire chiefs and police chiefs a predictable system that we can move to, and move out of interoperability being this connection sideways to these disparate radio spectrums. And if we don't identify an adequate enough path moving forward, we're going to address our frequency spectrum limitations by adding yet another small swath out of yet another spectrum. And that will perpetuate the interoperability problems that we have faced for the last 30 years. And I hate to quote Dr. Phil, but I would just ask, how's that working for us? We have 30 years of giving us little slice by little slice by little slice, and we haven't got the job done. It's time to take this one-time opportunity, Mr. Chairman, when we vacated these TV stations, to allocate the D block to public safety. That will give us a predictable swath that will move us toward radio over internet protocol. Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, I appreciate the opportunity to be heard.
Thank you very much, Chief. This has been a steep technical hill for the committee to climb, for members to climb, for staff to climb. And I want to thank you all for helping us understand that. It still seems that there are some differences in viewpoint, or perhaps we're talking about technical standards in a slightly different way. What it comes down to is I remain concerned that Mr. Smith and I can both have handhelds, and each of us can talk with a chief, and yet we can't talk with each other, and all three of us have P25 certified systems. It seems to me that if it's P25 certified, we should have taken the standards and the testing to a point where these three P25 certified devices will all talk with each other rather than two of them not communicating. And I remain concerned about that. And evidently, there is consensus in the panel that progress has been made and that some important progress has been recently made. And I encourage all the parties which are active in this industry, the government players and the end user community, to work together in the best spirit of doing what's good for customers and shareholders, and especially the general public, to develop systems which are interoperable, dependably so, and permit additional layers to be added on without dire problems. And it's in that spirit that I want to seriously consider holding a follow-up hearing to see where we are on this and to clarify issues that remain unclear, and that I'll take responsibility for the fact that perhaps we haven't dug deeply enough in this particular hearing. Again, I want to thank each and every one of you for appearing, for your travel time, for your preparation time. The record will remain open for 2 weeks for additional statements from members and for additional questions, and your answers to follow-up questions that the committee may ask. And the witnesses are now excused, and the hearing is adjourned. Thank you very much.